Margaret Collins thought the worst part of her flight was being seated beside an elderly black couple. With cold disgust, she demanded the flight attendant move her, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. The couple stayed silent, holding on to their dignity while every passenger watched the tension build like a courtroom waiting for the final verdict. But when the captain made one unexpected decision, the whole plane erupted, and Margaret's cruelty became the very thing that shamed her before everyone. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Rain hammered against the glass walls of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, turning the late autumn night into a blur of silver streaks and gold reflections. Outside, runway lights shimmered across the wet tarmac like broken necklaces scattered under the storm. Inside Terminal B, travelers hurried beneath the warm, yellow glow of the departure hall, dragging suitcases through puddles of light and shadow, while distant thunder rolled low enough to make the windows tremble. Margaret Collins hated weather that delayed things. At 54, Margaret had built her entire life around the idea that discomfort was for other people. She was a tall, white woman with a narrow face, carefully sculpted cheekbones, and the kind of polished appearance that suggested she had never once left the house without first checking her reflection from 3 different angles. Her blonde hair, streaked with expensive silver highlights, fell in a neat, shoulder-length style that still held its shape even in airport humidity. She wore a cream cashmere coat over a fitted navy dress, pearl earrings, and heeled leather boots, too elegant for practical travel. Everything about her said control, and Margaret valued control more than kindness. She had not always been this sharp around the edges. Years earlier, before her divorce, before the charity galas and social committees and the endless competition of upper-class Atlanta circles, she had been softer, or at least quieter. But humiliation had changed her. Her husband had left her for a younger woman with a brighter smile and fewer opinions, and Margaret had responded by becoming the kind of person no one could easily wound again. She sharpened herself into poise, into status, into someone who believed that money could protect dignity. Over time, she stopped noticing that her dignity had curdled into arrogance. Tonight, her irritation had already been simmering since sunset. The storm had delayed boarding by 37 minutes. Her car service had taken too long at drop-off. A barista in the lounge had spelled her name wrong, and now, with Seattle still 5 hours away, Margaret moved down the jet bridge in a mood so brittle it seemed one more inconvenience might make her shatter. Ahead of her, passengers shuffled into the cabin, lifting bags, murmuring apologies, and blocking the aisle in all the ordinary ways people did when they forgot there were others around them. Margaret exhaled sharply and tightened her grip on the strap of her handbag. Flight 728 to Seattle smelled faintly of coffee, rain-damp coats, and recycled air. The overhead bins clicked open and shut like impatient jaws. A soft instrumental tune played from hidden speakers, trying and failing to calm the weary crowd. Near the entrance stood Emily Carter, the lead flight attendant for the evening. Emily was 29, African-American, medium height, slim and graceful, with deep brown skin and observant dark eyes that seemed to notice every detail in a room before anyone else did. Her uniform was crisp, her scarf perfectly tied, and her hair was pulled into a low, flawless bun that gave her a composed, professional air. There was a calm steadiness in her face, but beneath it lived a quiet determination. She had grown up in Charlotte with a mother who worked double shifts as a nurse and taught her that professionalism was not weakness. Emily had learned early how to remain calm while being underestimated. She had spent 6 years as a flight attendant, and tonight was her first long-haul assignment as lead cabin attendant. She intended to earn every ounce of respect the role required. So when she greeted each passenger, her smile was warm but measured, the smile of a woman who took her responsibilities seriously. "Welcome aboard," she said as Margaret approached. "Row 22 is straight down on your left." Margaret barely glanced at her. Emily had met enough travelers to recognize trouble before it announced itself. Some passengers carried stress like a suitcase, Margaret wore it like perfume. Still, Emily simply nodded and continued greeting others. In row 22, seated together by the window and middle seat, were Elijah and Ruth Brooks. Elijah Brooks was 81, a black man with deep brown skin lined by age and weather, broad shoulders softened by time, and silver-gray hair trimmed close to his head. He had the quiet bearing of someone who had once been physically powerful and never needed to prove it. His hands were large and worn, his posture slightly stooped but still dignified, and his eyes, dark, thoughtful, and tired, carried the faraway calm of a man who had seen harder things than most people could imagine. He wore a clean brown blazer over a plaid shirt and dark trousers, clothes chosen not for fashion, but for respect. There was a faint stiffness in the way he adjusted himself in the seat, suggesting an old injury that never truly left. Beside him sat Ruth Brooks, 78, slight and elegant in the understated way that only truly gentle people often are. She had warm, brown skin, soft wrinkles around kind eyes, and silver curls tucked neatly beneath a light cream headscarf. She wore a pale blue cardigan over a simple dress and held her handbag carefully on her lap, as though it contained something precious. Ruth had the face of a woman who had spent most of her life comforting others. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and soothing. But there was strength in her, too. The steady kind, the kind built not by speeches but by years of surviving disappointments without letting them turn into bitterness. In her handbag, wrapped carefully beneath a folded handkerchief, was a small velvet box. Every few minutes, almost without thinking, Ruth touched the outside of the bag to make sure it was still there. Elijah noticed. "You still checking on it?" he asked softly. Ruth smiled without looking at him. "I'll stop when we land." "You said that at the gate." "And I meant it then, too." He chuckled under his breath, and the sound between them was old and familiar, the kind married people earned after a lifetime of shared worry. When Margaret reached row 22 and looked at her boarding pass, she froze. 22A, her seat. For one suspended second, she said nothing. Her eyes moved from the paper in her hand to Elijah by the window, to Ruth in the middle seat, then back again as if reality might correct itself if she looked hard enough. It did not. Her mouth tightened. Elijah, noticing her, gave a small, polite nod. "Evening." Margaret did not return it. She stood rigid in the aisle, forcing a few passengers behind her to stop. Someone sighed. A roller bag clipped the armrest. Overhead, the cabin lights glowed too brightly, making every expression impossible to hide. Margaret leaned back slightly as if she had stepped too close to something offensive. "No," she said under her breath. Ruth turned to look at her, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm sorry?" Margaret lifted her chin. "This can't be right." Elijah's hand moved quietly over Ruth's, not possessive, not fearful, just present. Margaret checked the boarding pass again, though she already knew what it said. Then she glanced toward the front of the cabin. "Excuse me," she called, louder now. "Flight attendant." Her tone cut through the noise of boarding with the sharpness of a snapped wire. Emily looked up from helping a man with an overhead bag and made her way down the aisle. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret held up the pass between two fingers as though it were evidence in a courtroom. "There has been some mistake." Emily glanced at it. "Row 22A, yes, that would be this seat here." Margaret gave a humorless laugh. "Clearly you don't understand my situation." A hush moved across the nearby rows, subtle but real. People always sensed when ordinary irritation was becoming something uglier. Emily kept her voice neutral. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" Margaret did not lower her voice. "You've seated me here," she said, gesturing openly toward Elijah and Ruth, "and I am not willing to remain in this row. I want another seat." The words hung in the air. Ruth's fingers tightened around her handbag. Elijah's jaw shifted once, the only sign that he had heard exactly what everyone else had. Emily's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "All assigned seats are based on booking, ma'am. If there's another available seat, I can certainly check." Margaret folded her arms, then check because I am not sitting here. There were many ways to wound people. Some were loud, some were quiet. This one was both. Across the aisle, a young woman pretending to scroll her phone stopped pretending. 2 rows back, a businessman looked up from his laptop. Behind row 22, a little boy leaned between the seats, his eyes wide with that open confusion only children carry honestly. He was about 8 years old, a small white boy with sandy hair that refused to stay combed and an earnest face scattered with freckles. He wore a red hoodie and held a stuffed dinosaur under one arm. His name was Caleb Turner, and unlike the adults around him, he had not yet learned how often people hid cruelty behind manners. He tugged at his mother's sleeve. His mother, Jenna Turner, was in her 30s, tired-looking but gentle, dressed in a denim jacket and sneakers. The kind of woman who seemed permanently one inconvenience away from exhaustion and still managed kindness anyway. She put a hand over Caleb's arm, hoping to quiet him, but Caleb whispered not nearly quietly enough, "Why is that lady so angry?" The question landed like a bell. Several passengers looked away. Margaret flushed, though whether from embarrassment or outrage was hard to tell. Emily answered before anyone else could. "Sometimes people are having a hard evening," she said, still calm, still professional. Caleb frowned. "But they didn't do anything." Jenna murmured, "Caleb, honey." Ruth turned slightly and offered the child a small, sad smile. "It's all right, baby." That almost made it worse. Margaret shifted her bag higher on her shoulder. "I don't need a lecture from a child. I need a different seat." Emily stood a little straighter. Training had taught her how to de-escalate conflict. Experience had taught her how humiliation often disguised itself as preference. And her own life had taught her what it meant to stand in a room and feel someone else's contempt searching for a place to land. But tonight, as lead, every decision mattered. This was her first flight in charge. One wrong tone, one visible crack in her composure, and a difficult passenger could become an incident report. So she folded her hands lightly in front of her and chose restraint. "I understand you're uncomfortable, ma'am," Emily said. "Please allow me a few moments to review the seating situation." Margaret gave a curt nod, as if this were the minimum she should have been offered from the start. Emily turned to Elijah and Ruth. "I'm sorry for the delay in boarding. Thank you for your patience." Elijah met her eyes and gave the faintest nod, man to professional, pain to dignity. "No trouble," he said quietly, but it was trouble. Everyone knew it. As Emily walked back toward the galley, she felt the weight of the cabin at her back. The listening, the judgment, the fragile line between civility and cruelty. She kept her pace steady, though her heart had begun to beat a little harder. In row 22, Margaret remained standing in the aisle like a woman refusing a sentence. Elijah squeezed Ruth's hand once. Ruth looked down at her handbag, fingertips brushing the hidden velvet box inside. She took a slow breath, then lifted her chin with the grace of someone who had practiced surviving indignity without surrendering herself to it. Outside, rain streaked across the oval windows. Inside, the storm had only just begun. The cabin remained suspended in the uneasy stillness Emily had left behind. Rain continued to stripe the windows in silver lines, and the low hum of the aircraft's systems blended with the muffled shuffle of late boarding. Yet row 22 had become the emotional center of the plane. Every nearby passenger now hyper-aware that something ugly had cracked through the thin shell of travel politeness. Margaret Collins still stood in the aisle, one hand gripping the strap of her designer handbag, her posture rigid with entitlement. The pause in Emily's return only seemed to harden her mood. "Well," she muttered, loud enough for 3 surrounding rows to hear, "I assume she understands what kind of situation this is." The businessman across the aisle glanced up from his laptop again. A college-aged girl by the window in row 21 frowned openly. Even Caleb, the little boy behind them, had gone quiet. Sensing the tension was no longer simple frustration, but something adults preferred not to name. Margaret exhaled sharply and tilted her head toward Elijah and Ruth as if they themselves were the inconvenience rather than her cruelty. "I booked this flight weeks ago," she said, not addressing them directly but making sure every word landed on them anyway. People pay good money for certain expectations. Ruth lowered her eyes for a moment, her fingers still resting lightly on her handbag. Beside her, Elijah remained motionless, his broad, weathered hand wrapped gently over hers. The silent gesture of a man who had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes strongest when it refused to wrestle with ugliness. Elijah Brooks had spent 81 years mastering restraint. The years had lined his deep brown face with patience, but tonight there was something heavier in his eyes, not anger, but memory. He had seen this expression before on strangers' faces in train stations, diners, and terminals across the South in the 1960s. The setting changed. The contempt rarely did. He leaned slightly toward Ruth and said softly, "Don't let this steal the night." Ruth gave him a faint smile, the kind born of a marriage so deep that entire conversations lived in glances. At 78, Ruth Brooks carried gentleness like a quiet light. But beneath her softness was the resilience of a woman who had spent 58 years building a life with the same man through storms far greater than this aisle-bound humiliation. Her cream headscarf framed a face aged by time but warmed by grace, and though Margaret's words cut, Ruth had long ago learned not to let bitterness rent space in her heart. Still, as she shifted slightly in her seat, her handbag tipped. A small paper slip fluttered free and drifted to the carpeted aisle. Ruth gasped softly, "Oh!" Before she could bend down, someone from across the aisle reached for it. The young woman who picked it up was Vanessa Miller, 26, a white graduate student from Seattle with chestnut hair pulled into a loose ponytail and sharp hazel eyes behind round glasses. She wore an oversized green sweater, jeans, and the thoughtful, observant expression of someone used to studying people as closely as books. Vanessa had spent the last year researching American civil rights history for her doctoral thesis, and the yellowed paper in her fingers immediately caught her attention. "This looks old," she said gently, handing it toward Ruth. Then she paused. The faded lettering, though fragile with age, was still readable. Flight 247, U.S. Military Charter, May 1968. Vanessa's eyes widened. "Wait, this is from 1968. Ruth's face softened in surprise and then tenderness. "Yes," she said, carefully taking the ticket back. "That's the flight where we met." For the first time since boarding, the energy around row 22 shifted. Nearby passengers who had been silently judging Margaret now leaned into a different kind of attention. Curiosity. Even Caleb whispered, "That old ticket is older than Grandma." A few passengers smiled despite themselves. Vanessa leaned forward, fascinated. "You met on a military flight?" Elijah's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "I was 23. Air Force Transport Division thought I knew everything." "And I was 20, Ruth added, glancing at him. "A volunteer nurse on my way to San Diego." Margaret rolled her eyes. Wonderful. A story hour. But no one was listening to her anymore. Ruth carefully unfolded the brittle edge of the ticket and ran her thumb over the faded print as if touching the memory itself. The plane was delayed for 6 hours because of storms in Texas. We sat on metal chairs near Gate 4. He offered me the only cup of coffee in the room. Elijah chuckled. "I offered it, because you looked ready to march into the control tower." "I was," Ruth said, smiling. Vanessa's expression warmed. "And that was it?" Elijah shook his head. "Not quite. We spent the whole flight talking. She told me she wanted a house with blue shutters one day." Ruth turned to him, amused. "And you told me you'd build it yourself." "I did." "Did you?" Elijah squeezed her hand. "Blue shutters and all." For a few brief moments, the cabin tension gave way to something gentler. Several passengers exchanged quiet smiles. Caleb's mother, Jenna, leaned closer to listen, visibly moved. Even the businessman across the aisle. Gregory Hale, a 42-year-old tech executive with neatly combed dark hair, a charcoal suit, and the detached efficiency of someone used to turning human moments into digital currency, lowered his phone slightly after discreetly recording the exchange. Gregory was the kind of man who rarely traveled without scanning for opportunity. Tonight, what had begun as a recording of a rude confrontation had unexpectedly turned into something far more powerful: grace under humiliation. He angled his phone carefully, making sure Emily's empty aisle space and Margaret's rigid silhouette remained in frame. At the front galley, Emily Carter stood with one hand lightly resting against the service counter, breathing once before pressing the intercom line to the cockpit. Her reflection in the metal panel caught her eye. Composed face, straight shoulders, perfect uniform. But behind that exterior, something deeply personal had been stirred. Margaret's tone had brought back a memory Emily never fully lost. She was 9 years old again, standing in a department store in Charlotte while her mother, Angela Carter, a tall black woman with tired eyes, nurse's shoes, and endless dignity, waited at a register. Emily remembered the cashier skipping over her mother to help a white customer who had arrived later. She remembered her mother's calm face, the way she said, "We don't let other people decide our worth." Emily had carried that lesson into every cabin, every difficult interaction, every smile forced under pressure. Tonight, it mattered more than ever. The cockpit door opened a crack after the security chime, and Captain Daniel Whitmore stepped partly into view. Captain Whitmore was 61, a white man with the silver hair trimmed with military precision, steel blue eyes, and the posture of someone who had spent decades making decisions others trusted with their lives. His face was stern in rest, carved by responsibility rather than harshness, but there was unmistakable humanity beneath it. Former Air Force before commercial aviation, Daniel had a reputation among crews for being uncompromising about protocol and unexpectedly compassionate when it counted. "What do we have?" he asked quietly. Emily explained the situation with measured clarity, careful not to inject emotion into the facts. But Daniel read more than the words. He had flown long enough to understand the difference between a seating complaint and a moral failure unfolding at 30,000 feet before takeoff. He looked past her toward the cabin, where the low murmur still rippled. "And the couple?" "Calm," Emily said, "far calmer than they should have to be." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "I see." Emily hesitated, then added, "Sir, I believe how we handle this will define the entire flight." The captain studied her for a moment, seeing not just a lead attendant doing her duty, but a woman choosing courage over convenience. "You handled the first part correctly," he said. "Let me consider the next." Back in row 22, Ruth carefully slipped the 1968 ticket back into her handbag, making sure it rested beside the velvet box. Margaret, still standing, crossed her arms. "I suppose everyone's entertained now." No one answered. And somehow, that silence, the refusal of the cabin to validate her cruelty, was heavier than any spoken rebuke. Outside, thunder rolled across Atlanta's night sky. Inside, Elijah looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the bag on her lap. And the memory of a flight that had once begun their life together now sat quietly beside the beginning of another storm. At the front of the aircraft, Captain Whitmore remained in thought. The next decision had not yet been spoken, and Chapter 2 ended there, with dignity still silent, but no longer alone. The silence Captain Daniel Whitmore left behind seemed to stretch through the cabin like the pause before a courtroom verdict. Rain still traced restless silver lines across the windows, and the aircraft lights glowed softly against the dark Atlanta runway. But inside, row 22, every breath felt louder than it should. Margaret Collins remained standing in the aisle, her chin raised, her arms folded tightly across the cream cashmere coat draped over her shoulders. The cold confidence on her face had returned now that Emily had been gone long enough to suggest progress. In Margaret's mind, delays always ended in her favor. Her entire life had reinforced that expectation. Money solved problems, status rearranged inconveniences, and people in uniform usually found ways to satisfy those who spoke with enough certainty. So when Emily Carter finally reappeared from the front galley, Margaret's mouth curved into the faint beginning of a victorious smile. Emily walked with calm, deliberate professionalism. But tonight there was a new steadiness in her expression, At 29, she had already mastered the art of emotional control, yet this moment carried something more than training. Her dark, observant eyes moved first to Elijah and Ruth, then briefly toward Margaret, before she came to a stop beside row 22. Several nearby passengers instinctively straightened in their seats. Gregory Hale, the businessman across the aisle, subtly lifted his phone again, careful to keep the device angled low. He was a sharp-featured man in his early 40s with the polished composure of someone used to spotting viral moments before they happened. Years in the tech world had taught him that the internet moved on emotion, and what was happening here had all the ingredients: injustice, suspense, and the possibility of public redemption. Behind row 22, Caleb Turner leaned eagerly between the seats, clutching his stuffed dinosaur under one arm. "Well?" Margaret asked before Emily could even begin. "I assume this has been corrected." Emily did not flinch. "Ma'am," she said evenly, "as I explained, economy and business class are both completely full." Margaret's smile widened anyway, because in her mind there was only one sentence left. Emily continued, her voice carrying clearly enough for the nearby rows to hear. "However, the captain has made a special decision." A ripple moved through the cabin. Margaret's lips parted in satisfied triumph. Her eyes gleamed with the smug certainty of someone already imagining herself in a wide leather first-class seat, sipping sparkling water while everyone around her silently acknowledged that she had won. She adjusted the strap of her handbag and tilted her head toward the front of the aircraft as if preparing to be escorted. "Good," she said, barely concealing her satisfaction. "I knew there had to be a proper solution." But Emily did not turn toward Margaret. Instead, she turned toward Elijah and Ruth Brooks. The shift was so small, so controlled, that for half a second, Margaret did not understand what she was seeing. Emily's face softened into genuine respect. "Mr. and Mrs. Brooks," she said warmly, "Captain Whitmore would be honored to invite you both to first class." The words landed with the force of a judge's gavel. For one heartbeat, the cabin froze. Margaret's smile vanished so quickly it was almost startling. Her expression emptied into disbelief, as if language itself had failed to behave properly. Ruth blinked, stunned. "Us?" Emily nodded. "Yes, ma'am. The captain feels it would be more appropriate." Elijah looked up slowly, his dark, thoughtful eyes meeting Emily's. For a moment, the old soldier's face revealed something he rarely allowed others to see. Hurt transformed into gratitude. "That's very kind," he said quietly. The stillness shattered. Caleb was the first. The 8-year-old boy slapped his hands together with bright, delighted enthusiasm, the stuffed dinosaur nearly tumbling from his lap. His innocent applause rang through the cabin like the first crack in a dam. "That's good," he exclaimed, and just like that, the rest of the aircraft followed. One pair of hands, then another, then dozens more. The applause rolled through the cabin in a rising wave, warm, loud, and unstoppable. Passengers who had sat in horrified silence through Margaret's cruelty now stood emotionally united in a single spontaneous act of approval. Vanessa Miller smiled openly as she clapped. Jenna Turner joined in, her eyes bright with emotion. Even Gregory Hale, never one to lose himself in sentiment, lowered his phone just long enough to clap once before capturing the scene again. The sound filled the aircraft with something stronger than outrage. Justice. Margaret stood motionless in the aisle, her face pale beneath the cabin lights. For perhaps the first time in years, she had no script. No sharp comeback came to her lips. No amount of wealth, no social standing, no cultivated superiority could protect her from what had just happened. The humiliation she had intended for others now stood fully illuminated around her, reflected in every pair of eyes that refused to look away. Her fingers tightened around her bag strap. "This is ridiculous," she whispered, but the words had no power now. Ruth slowly rose from her seat, still visibly overwhelmed. Her warm brown face carried both grace and disbelief, and when she stood, she instinctively pressed one hand over her handbag where the velvet box and the old ticket still rested. Another flight attendant stepped forward from the galley to assist. Her name was Laura Bennett, a white woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair tucked into a neat twist beneath her flight scarf. Laura had kind gray eyes and the easy competence of someone who had spent a decade navigating cramped aisles, nervous passengers, and moments when humanity suddenly mattered more than procedure. Though she had entered the scene quietly, her expression made it clear she had seen enough to understand exactly why this decision mattered. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," Laura said gently, reaching for Ruth's handbag. Ruth hesitated, then smiled softly and handed it over. Laura immediately noticed the careful weight of the bag and the way Ruth's hand lingered over it. "Something important in here?" Laura asked with a light, curious kindness. Ruth's smile deepened, touched with memory. "Very." Laura nodded, respecting the boundary, but her curiosity remained. Whatever rested inside that velvet box clearly carried a history larger than the leather bag that held it. Elijah rose more slowly. At 81, he was still broad-shouldered, but age had introduced stiffness into movements that were once effortless. As he pushed himself upright, his right leg hesitated before taking weight, and the pain that flickered across his face was brief but unmistakable. Emily noticed immediately. "Take your time, sir." Elijah gave a faint nod. The limp was subtle, but once seen it could not be unseen. Each step carried the careful control of a man who had lived with old damage for decades. It was not the weakness of age alone. It was the disciplined movement of someone long accustomed to pain. Caleb watched with wide eyes. "Mom," he whispered, "why does he walk like that?" Jenna leaned closer and answered softly, "Because some people carry old battles with them." The line lingered in the air, quiet, but powerful. Vanessa, hearing it, glanced toward Elijah's face and thought of the military flight ticket from 1968. Pieces were beginning to form a larger story. As Elijah stepped into the aisle, Gregory's phone captured the image perfectly. The elderly black veteran moving slowly toward first class while the woman who had insulted him stood frozen in public disgrace. It was already the kind of moment the internet would remember. Margaret moved aside at last, but only because the aisle now demanded it. Her expensive heels shifted awkwardly against the carpet as Elijah passed. He did not look at her. Neither did Ruth. That absence of acknowledgement somehow stung more deeply than anger could have. Ruth paused just long enough beside Caleb's row to offer him a grateful smile. "You started that applause, sweetheart." Caleb grinned. "Because you won." Ruth's eyes shimmered slightly. "No, baby. Kindness won." Laura led the way toward the front of the aircraft, carefully holding Ruth's bag. Emily walked beside Elijah at a respectful pace, adjusting her stride to match his slower steps. The applause gradually softened into murmurs, then into a heavy emotional quiet. Margaret finally lowered herself into 22A, but the seat no longer felt like a victory reclaimed. It felt small, exposed. Outside, thunder rolled once more across Atlanta's stormy night. Inside, Elijah and Ruth Brooks moved slowly down the aisle toward first class, toward dignity publicly restored, while behind them, Margaret sat in stunned silence, trapped in the echo of her own cruelty. And that was where Chapter 3 ended. With the entire cabin still carrying the aftershock of the captain's decision, the old couple walking forward and the woman who thought she had won left speechless in row 22. First class felt like another world. The lighting was softer, the seats wider, the air quieter, as if the front of the aircraft had been designed to separate people not only by price but by atmosphere itself. Outside, rain still swept across the runway windows in silver sheets, and the storm over Atlanta muttered in distant thunder. But here, the tension of row 22 gave way to a slower, more intimate silence. Emily Carter guided Elijah and Ruth Brooks into the two open first-class seats on the left side of the cabin, helping Elijah lower himself carefully into the aisle seat before Ruth settled beside the window. Laura Bennett gently placed Ruth's handbag on the armrest between them. "There you are," Laura said with a kind smile. Ruth reached for the bag immediately, fingertips brushing the leather as if reassuring herself that the memories inside had survived the humiliation of the aisle. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. Laura gave a polite nod and stepped away, sensing this moment belonged to something older and more fragile than airline service. Emily remained. At 29, Emily had always believed professionalism meant knowing when to stay detached. But tonight, the line between duty and humanity had blurred. The dignity with which Elijah and Ruth had carried themselves through Margaret's cruelty had already moved her. Now, with the storm muffled beyond the cabin walls and the first-class curtains partly shielding them from the rest of the aircraft, the quiet felt personal. She crouched slightly beside Ruth's seat, lowering herself to eye level. "Mrs. Brooks," Emily said gently, "I hope you don't mind me asking." Earlier, when Laura mentioned the bag, it seemed like there was something very special inside. Ruth's warm brown eyes softened. For a long moment she said nothing, simply resting her hand over the handbag while Elijah stared ahead at the dark runway lights beyond the oval window. Then Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that carried both pride and grief. "There is," she said. Carefully, almost ceremonially, she lifted the small velvet box from the handbag and placed it on the tray table between them. The box itself was deep navy, worn smooth at the corners by years of careful handling. It was small enough to fit in Ruth's palm, yet the way she touched it made it seem heavier than metal. Emily felt her breath catch. Ruth opened it. Inside, resting against cream satin lining, was a Purple Heart medal. Its purple ribbon gleamed softly beneath the cabin lights, the gold border catching the faint reflections from the rain outside. Beside it, folded carefully beneath the medal, was an old photograph worn pale at the edges. Ruth lifted the photo first. It showed a younger Elijah Brooks, perhaps in his early 30s, standing beside an Air Force aircraft in full dress uniform. His posture was straight and proud, his jaw strong, his dark eyes steady beneath the brim of a service cap. Behind him, the nose of the aircraft gleamed beneath what looked like floodlights, and on the back, someone had written in fading blue ink, "Seattle, 1986. Emily stared at the image, then at the man beside her whose lined face still carried the same quiet strength. "This is you," she whispered. Elijah gave the smallest nod. Before he could speak, his gaze drifted again toward the rain-streaked darkness outside. The storm seemed to pull him inward, toward memories he had not revisited in decades. At 81, Elijah Brooks wore age with dignity, but tonight something else weighed on him. Sleeplessness. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened during boarding, and Emily now understood why. Returning to Seattle for the first time in 40 years had dragged old ghosts into the present. Since leaving Atlanta that afternoon, he had barely spoken of the city. Ruth knew why. Seattle was where everything changed. Ruth gently touched the medal. "We're flying there because tomorrow they're honoring him." Emily turned back to her. Honoring him for what? Ruth's fingers trembled faintly as she lifted the Purple Heart from the box. For saving 43 people. The words settled into the first-class cabin like sacred truth. Emily blinked, stunned. Ruth continued, her voice soft but unwavering. 40 years ago, there was an aircraft fire on the runway in Seattle. Elijah was the pilot. Smoke filled the cabin before the evacuation systems could deploy. He stayed in that cockpit until every passenger and crew member made it out. Emily's eyes widened as she looked again at Elijah, whose expression remained calm but distant, as though the man in the photo and the old gentleman beside her were separated by more than time. "The fire spread before he got clear," Ruth added. "That's how he injured his leg, and this," she touched the Purple Heart, "was awarded afterward." Emily's throat tightened. In the coach cabin behind them, passengers had seen only an elderly black man walking slowly down an aisle. Here, in the quiet intimacy of first class, the truth stood revealed. He was not simply an old man with pain in his step, he was a decorated hero. Elijah finally spoke, his voice low and rough with memory. The smoke was thick. Couldn't see more than a few feet, I just kept hearing people screaming. His hand rested absently over his knee, the same leg that had slowed him in the aisle. I still hear it sometimes, he admitted. Emily's heart tightened. The sleeplessness made sense now. Ruth looked at her husband with the ache of a woman who had spent decades watching courage leave scars no one else could see. He hasn't slept well in weeks, she said quietly. Not since the invitation came. The airline had invited Elijah back to Seattle to receive a long-overdue civilian and military aviation commendation for the rescue. The city planned to honor the surviving passengers who could attend. For Elijah, it was more than a ceremony. It was a return to the place where pain, duty, and survival had become inseparable. Emily glanced at the old photograph again. "This is your first time going back?" Elijah nodded. "First time in 40 years. Ruth reached for his hand. "And may be the last." The words came out softly, but they carried the full weight of love. Emily looked at her, startled. Ruth's eyes shimmered. His heart isn't strong anymore. The doctors said long flights aren't easy on him now. She smiled sadly. He insisted on coming anyway. Elijah gave a faint breath of humor. "Some things deserve one more landing." Emily had to look down for a moment to steady herself. This was no longer just a story of public humiliation and poetic justice. It was becoming something larger. A final journey, a homecoming. Perhaps even a farewell to unfinished memory. At the rear of the cabin, separated by the first-class curtain, Margaret Collins sat in 22A with her shoulders rigid. The applause had long faded, replaced by the softer, more dangerous sound of whispers. Passengers no longer bothered hiding their reactions. Vanessa's voice drifted from across the aisle. "Did you hear? He's some kind of war hero." Gregory Hale, still scrolling through the footage he had captured, murmured, "Not war hero, aviation hero. That clip's going to explode once people know who he is." Another passenger muttered just loud enough, "Imagine insulting a man like that." Margaret stared forward, jaw tight. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than it had before. Up front, Emily quietly stood and stepped toward the galley, her emotions still raw. She pulled out her phone for a brief crew coordination message and typed to the Seattle ground supervisor, "Passenger Elijah Brooks requires wheelchair assistance on arrival. Please arrange discreet honor reception at Gate 4 per Captain Whitmore's approval. Confirm veteran ceremony liaison standing by." She hesitated, then added, "This matters. Please make it special." After sending the message, Emily looked once more toward the first-class seats. Ruth had placed the Purple Heart back into the velvet box, but the old photograph remained on the tray table, catching the cabin light beside Elijah's steady hand. Outside, the rain over Atlanta finally began to ease. Inside, the secret in the velvet box had transformed the flight once again, not into a public spectacle now, but into something sacred, intimate, and deeply human. And that was where Chapter 4 ended. With the truth of Elijah's heroism revealed, the weight of his final return to Seattle hanging in the air, Margaret listening to whispers from behind, and Emily already preparing the ground for a welcome worthy of the man in the photograph. Seat 22A had not changed. The cushion was the same. The armrest was the same. The oval window beside Margaret Collins still carried long silver trails of rain from the storm over Atlanta, and the dimmed cabin lights still cast the same soft glow across the rows. Yet after Elijah and Ruth Brooks had been escorted to first class, the seat felt transformed into something far smaller than the premium life Margaret had spent years building around herself. It no longer felt like a place of control. It felt like a witness stand. Margaret sat rigidly, shoulders squared beneath her cream cashmere coat, hands folded too tightly over her handbag in her lap. Her polished appearance remained immaculate. Blonde hair perfectly in place, pearl earrings catching the cabin light, makeup untouched. But something beneath the surface had cracked. For the first time in years, she could not escape the sensation of being seen, not admired. Seen. Across the nearby rows, conversations resumed in low murmurs, but now every glance seemed to pass through her before drifting away. Some passengers looked openly, others pretended not to. The effect was worse than confrontation. Silence left room for judgment to grow teeth. Margaret fixed her gaze on the seatback screen in front of her, but she wasn't watching it. Her reflection stared back faintly from the black surface. Sharp cheekbones, controlled posture, the practiced face of a woman who had survived by never appearing vulnerable. And yet, vulnerability was exactly what had begun to settle in. Across the aisle, Vanessa Miller leaned toward an older woman seated beside her. The woman had been quiet during most of the incident, but now she studied Margaret with the focused recognition of someone reaching through memory. Her name was Eleanor Price, a 68-year-old white woman with short silver hair, warm gray eyes, and the upright bearing of a retired school principal. She wore a burgundy cardigan over a floral blouse and carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades reading truth in the way people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Eleanor's life in Seattle philanthropy circles had introduced her to more gala boards and charity committees than she cared to remember, and she knew Margaret Collins. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's her," she murmured. Vanessa glanced at her. "You know her?" Eleanor gave a faint, disappointed sigh. "Margaret Collins. She sits on the board of the Whitestone Futures Foundation." The name carried quiet weight. Whitestone Futures was a prestigious scholarship charity that publicly promoted educational equity while privately carrying rumors of selective bias. 2 years earlier, the organization had been criticized after leaked internal correspondence suggested minority applicants were routinely held to harsher standards than others. The scandal had faded without consequence, buried beneath public statements and polished legal language. But Eleanor remembered. She had resigned from an advisory role after the incident, unable to stomach the hypocrisy. Vanessa looked from Eleanor to Margaret, then toward the curtain separating first class. "So this isn't the first time?" "No," Eleanor said softly. "It's just the first time she couldn't hide behind a boardroom." The words drifted just far enough for Margaret to hear. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, anger rose instinctively, the old reflex that had protected her for decades. But the anger could not fully take hold because something far more dangerous had begun to surface beneath it. Memory. As the plane pushed back from the gate and the engines deepened into a powerful hum, Margaret found herself staring not at the rain-streaked window, but inward, into a childhood she had spent years repackaging into harmless nostalgia. Her father, Charles Whitmore Collins, had been a tall, severe white man with a lawyer's voice and a banker's principles. He believed in order, legacy, and the invisible hierarchies that made him feel the world was predictable. Margaret could still see him in their Savannah dining room, silver-haired even in his 40s, crisp tie, whiskey glass in hand, speaking casually about the right kind of people. At 8 years old, she had not understood the poison in those phrases. At 12, she repeated them. At 16, she learned how social circles rewarded them. By adulthood, the ideas had calcified into instinct, not loud hatred, something colder, distance, standards, the illusion that prejudice was merely preference wrapped in better vocabulary. Margaret had never truly examined it because her world rarely forced her to. Charity boards, country clubs, fundraising dinners, curated neighborhoods. Every room she entered reflected her assumptions back at her like polished glass. Until tonight, the image of Elijah Brooks walking slowly past her seat returned with painful clarity. The quiet dignity in his face, the applause, the first-class curtain closing behind him like a verdict. Margaret swallowed hard. Across the aisle, Gregory Hale's thumbs moved rapidly over his phone screen. At 42, Gregory was less interested in morality than momentum, and the clip he had captured now sat perfectly trimmed and ready for upload. The businessman's sharp, dark hair, tailored charcoal suit, and perpetually calculating expression made him look like someone who treated every human moment as data. He tapped post. The caption read, Respect has no class section. Within seconds, the likes began climbing. He refreshed again. Hundreds, then thousands. Gregory let out a quiet whistle. That's moving fast. Vanessa glanced over. You posted it already? He gave a small shrug. People need to see what dignity looks like. Margaret's stomach tightened. For the first time, the consequences of a single moment began to extend beyond the cabin walls. Behind her, Caleb Turner shifted in his seat. The 8-year-old had been quieter since the applause, his childish excitement replaced by the thoughtful seriousness children sometimes carried when they sensed adults had crossed an invisible line. He peeked around the seat and looked at Margaret. She no longer looked angry. She looked smaller. Caleb dug into the pocket of his red hoodie and pulled out a neatly folded tissue packet his mother always gave him for travel. Without announcing himself, he leaned forward and gently placed one tissue on Margaret's armrest. Margaret startled and turned. Caleb gave her a shy, uncertain smile. For, if you're sad. The simplicity of it struck harder than the applause had. Margaret stared at the tissue, then at the little boy's earnest face. There was no accusation there, no judgment, only the innocent instinct to comfort someone who looked like they might cry. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you," she said, and the words sounded strange in her own voice. Caleb nodded once and leaned back. The engines roared louder as the aircraft began its climb through the storm clouds, and the cabin lights dimmed for the ascent. Margaret turned to the seatback screen, but this time she tapped the airline Wi-Fi portal and opened her browser. Her fingers hovered. Then she typed, Elijah Brooks Seattle Pilot Rescue. The results appeared almost instantly. A newspaper archive from 1986 filled the screen. The black and white photo was unmistakable. A younger Elijah standing beside a burned aircraft, uniform darkened by soot, one leg bandaged, eyes exhausted but steady. The headline read, Air Force Pilot Saves 43 in Seattle, Runway, Fire. Margaret's breath caught. She opened another article, then another. Each one revealed more of the man she had dismissed with a glance. Decorated veteran, rescue pilot, recipient of military commendation, speaker at veteran support charities, survivor of smoke inhalation injuries that had caused chronic damage later in life. The article mentioned his wife, too. Ruth Brooks remained at a Harborview Medical Center for 9 nights while her husband recovered. Margaret stared at the sentence. 9 nights. A woman she had treated as lesser had once sat through hospital darkness waiting for the same man, now walking painfully toward a long overdue honor. The deeper Margaret read, the less stable her inner narrative became. This was no longer about embarrassment. It was about collision. The values she had inherited without question were colliding with the undeniable humanity of the people she had reduced to a seat assignment. The storm outside faded as the aircraft rose above the clouds, moonlight beginning to spill across the wing. In the softened darkness of seat 22A, Margaret looked down at the tissue Caleb had given her. Then back at the article glowing on her phone. For the first time in her life, she did not look away from the possibility that the ugliness she hated in others had been living quietly inside her all along. And that was where Chapter 5 ended. Margaret, alone in the same seat, surrounded by silent judgment, publicly connected to past discrimination, and forced at last to confront the roots of the prejudice she had mistaken for normalcy. By the time the aircraft began its descent, the storm had long since been left behind. Below the window line, Seattle shimmered beneath the late-night sky like a city made of wet glass and memory. Streetlights glowed amber against dark water, ferries traced faint silver paths across Elliott Bay, and the skyline rose through drifting mist as though the city itself had been waiting quietly for Elijah Brooks to return. Inside the cabin, the mood had changed again. What had begun in Atlanta as humiliation had become something heavier, almost reverent. The viral clip Gregory Hale had posted continued to spread across phones throughout the flight. By the time the seatbelt sign chimed on for landing, passengers around Margaret Collins were no longer whispering about a rude woman in coach. They were reading headlines, watching replayed footage, and piecing together the story of the elderly black veteran now seated in first class. Gregory refreshed the post one more time and let out a low breath. 3.2 million views, he muttered. Vanessa looked over in disbelief. Already? He turned the screen slightly so she could see. The caption, "Respect has no class section," now sat above thousands of comments praising the crew, the captain, and the dignity of Elijah and Ruth Brooks. The internet had done what airplanes sometimes do best: compress human drama into a single unforgettable moment and launch it into the world. Margaret sat very still in seat 22A. Caleb's tissue still folded beside her phone. She no longer looked like a woman preserving pride. She looked like someone bracing for truth. The wheels touched the Seattle runway with a firm, grounded thud. A ripple of relieved applause moved lightly through the cabin, softer than before but warm. Through the oval windows, the terminal lights glowed bright against the damp Pacific night. At the front of the aircraft, Emily Carter stood beside the galley with Laura Bennett, smoothing the front of her uniform as passengers remained seated. Her posture was calm, but inside she carried the quiet emotional exhaustion that comes after doing the right thing in a moment that mattered. Captain Daniel Whitmore stepped briefly out from the cockpit after shutdown. At 61, with silver hair precise as ever and steel blue eyes softened by what he now knew awaited them at the gate, he gave Emily a rare smile. "You handled this flight with grace," he said, loud enough for Laura and the nearby crew to hear. "Exactly the kind of leadership this job requires." For Emily, the words landed deeper than praise. Her first assignment as lead attendant had become far more than a professional test. It had become proof that dignity, when defended, could change the emotional direction of an entire cabin. "Thank you, Captain," she said quietly. Laura nudged her with a grin. "Your first lead, and the whole country's probably talking about it." Emily let out the smallest laugh, though emotion still lingered in her eyes. When the cabin door finally opened, cool Seattle air slipped into the aircraft. Then the passengers saw them. At the gate stood a military honor detail in formal dress uniform. 4 service members in deep blue ceremonial attire, polished shoes reflecting the terminal lights, medals aligned perfectly across their chests. Their posture was straight, solemn, and unwavering. At the center stood Master Sergeant Thomas Reed, a black man in his late 50s with a broad frame, close-cropped gray hair, and the composed gravity of a career serviceman. His expression held both duty and deep respect. Beside him waited a civilian event host holding a microphone and a folder. The moment the first-class curtain was drawn back, the terminal beyond the jet bridge fell into an almost sacred hush. Passengers instinctively stopped gathering bags. Elijah Brooks rose carefully with Emily's help, his injured leg slower after the long flight. Ruth stood beside him, one hand lightly touching his arm, the velvet box secure in her handbag. As soon as Elijah stepped through the aircraft doorway, the honor detail saluted. Every sound in the jet bridge seemed to vanish. Margaret, now standing several rows back in the slow-moving line of passengers, watched as the old man she had once reduced to a seat assignment was greeted with the respect usually reserved for heads of state and fallen heroes. The civilian host, a tall woman in her 40s named Melissa Grant, fair-skinned, dark-haired, poised, and practiced in the warm, commanding voice of public ceremonies, lifted the microphone. Her tone carried clearly through the terminal. "Tonight, Seattle welcomes home Captain Elijah Brooks," she announced, "the hero who saved 43 passengers during the runway fire emergency of 1979. The words struck Margaret with the force of something undeniable. Not an article, not a rumor, not a quiet fact on a phone screen. A public truth. Passengers in the terminal began clapping. Some airport staff who had gathered near the gate joined in. A few older veterans standing nearby removed their caps. Margaret's breath caught sharply. She saw Elijah pause, overwhelmed but composed, his weathered face illuminated by the gate lights. Ruth looked up at him with the kind of love that had survived decades of pain, fear, and sacrifice. And suddenly Margaret saw the entire story in one unbearable image. The injured pilot, the wife waiting 9 nights in the hospital, the Purple Heart, the limp, the sleeplessness, the return after 40 years. Her throat tightened. Then, without warning, tears filled her eyes. Margaret Collins had spent most of her adult life believing tears were weakness. She had trained herself to weaponize poise, to remain untouchable, to move through rooms as though judgment only flowed outward from her, and never inward. But here, in the bright, fluorescent honesty of Gate 4 in Seattle, the illusion collapsed. A tear slipped free, then another. She covered her mouth, stunned by the force of her own emotion. The shame was no longer about public embarrassment. It was grief. Grief for the years spent carrying prejudice she had mistaken for refinement. Grief for the people she had likely wounded without ever pausing long enough to see them fully. Grief for the man standing before her now, whose life had embodied service, sacrifice, and dignity while she had offered him contempt. Caleb, standing with his mother a few steps away, looked up at Margaret with quiet recognition. He didn't smile this time. He simply understood. Margaret took 1 step forward, then another. The crowd parted enough for her to reach the edge of the small reception line where Ruth stood beside Elijah. Ruth turned first, her kind face calm but guarded. Margaret's voice broke before the first word fully formed. "I was wrong." The sentence trembled in the cold Seattle air. She looked first at Ruth, then at Elijah, forcing herself not to look away. "There is no excuse for what I said, no excuse for what I thought." Tears tracked down her carefully made-up face now, leaving visible lines through the foundation she had once believed could protect her from being read. "I judged you before I knew anything about you, and even if I had known nothing, it still would have been wrong." Elijah held her gaze. At 81, his face had seen war, fire, injury, and survival. He understood the difference between humiliation and remorse. Margaret swallowed hard. "I insulted a man who gave his life to saving others, a woman who stood beside him through it all." Her voice softened into raw honesty. "I am deeply sorry." For a moment, no one moved. Then Ruth stepped forward. Her warm, brown eyes carried sorrow, but not cruelty. "Thank you for saying it," she said gently. The simplicity of the response undid Margaret more completely than anger ever could have. A voice called from the side. "Mrs. Collins?" A reporter had stepped through the gathering crowd. Her name was Nina Foster, a slim Asian-American journalist in her early 30s with sharp eyes, a navy trench coat, and the quick instinct of someone who could sense when a public moment was becoming a human story. A local Seattle news badge hung from her neck. "Would you be willing to say something on camera?" Nina asked carefully. "About what changed for you tonight?" Margaret turned, still tearful, startled by the question, but before she answered she looked once more at Elijah and Ruth. Not as symbols, as people. And that was where Chapter 6 ended, with Elijah honored at Gate 4, Emily publicly praised by the captain, the viral clip spreading across millions of screens, Margaret in tears before the truth of who Elijah really was, and a reporter's question hanging in the air about what transformation truly means. 1 month later, Seattle wore the soft gold of early evening. The rain had lifted hours before sunset, leaving the city washed clean and glowing beneath streaks of amber light. The glass walls of Harborview Veterans Hall reflected the orange sky, and beyond them the distant silhouettes of planes rose and descended over SeaTac like quiet reminders that some journeys never truly ended when the wheels touched the ground. Margaret Collins stepped out of the car with none of the sharpness she had carried onto the Atlanta flight. At 54, she was still elegant, still poised, but the woman who crossed the stone walkway toward the fundraiser entrance no longer used appearance as armor. Her blonde hair was simpler now, brushed naturally over the shoulders of a charcoal coat. Her makeup was light, almost understated. More importantly, there was a softness in her face that had not existed a month earlier, the look of someone who had finally allowed truth to change the architecture of her life. The banner above the entrance read, Veterans Legacy Fundraiser, honoring Captain Elijah Brooks. Inside, the ballroom glowed with warm chandeliers, polished wood, and framed photographs of servicemen and women from different eras. Round tables filled the room, occupied by veterans, military families, civic leaders, and donors. At the center stage stood Elijah Brooks, no longer simply the elderly man from Seat 22A, but the honored guest whose story had inspired thousands far beyond Seattle. Elijah looked stronger tonight. At 81, the years still showed in the silver at his temples and the careful weight he placed on his injured leg. But the month since the flight had given him something unexpected. Peace. Returning to Seattle had reopened wounds, yes, but it had also allowed him to place honor where memory had once held only pain. His dark, thoughtful eyes now carried less of the sleepless distance Emily had noticed on the plane. Beside him stood Ruth Brooks, radiant in a deep blue dress with a cream shawl draped around her shoulders. Her silver curls framed a face warmed by kindness, and in her hands she carried a neatly folded knitted scarf in soft gray wool. When Margaret entered, conversation softened. People recognized her, not as the woman from the viral video anymore, but as the woman whose public apology had sparked a national conversation about prejudice, dignity, and accountability. A month earlier, Margaret had returned to Atlanta and done something no one in her old social circle expected. She liquidated the entire discretionary fund she had privately controlled through Whitestone Futures and redirected it into scholarships for the children and grandchildren of Black veterans across the country. Tonight, she had come to announce the permanent version of that promise. When the MC invited her to the podium, the room waited in respectful silence. Margaret stepped onto the stage slowly, her hand steady around the notes she no longer needed. "I spent much of my life confusing comfort with character," she began. The room remained still. Her voice was calm, clear, and honest. "1 month ago, on a flight from Atlanta to Seattle, I looked at Captain Elijah Brooks and his wife Ruth, and saw only my own prejudice reflected back at me. I reduced 2 extraordinary human beings to a seat assignment because I had spent decades carrying beliefs I never had the courage to question." She paused, letting the truth breathe. "In one night, I learned what dignity looks like. It looks like silence that refuses to become bitterness. It looks like service without pride. It looks like forgiveness offered when anger would be easier." Her eyes found Elijah and Ruth. "And it changed me." A quiet murmur of emotion moved through the room. Margaret continued. "Tonight, I'm honored to announce the official launch of the Brooks Dignity Fund, a scholarship foundation dedicated to supporting the descendants of Black veterans whose families carried the unseen cost of service." The applause that followed was not explosive like the airplane cabins. It was warmer, deeper, the kind of applause reserved for something healing. Elijah bowed his head slightly, visibly moved. Ruth's eyes shimmered. In the audience, Emily Carter smiled. She had flown in from Atlanta that afternoon, not as crew this time, but as an invited guest. At 29, Emily now carried herself with a new confidence earned from the flight that had changed her career. 2 weeks earlier, the airline had promoted her to cabin supervisor for transcontinental operations, a role that reflected not only her technical skill, but the moral clarity she had shown under pressure. Laura Bennett, seated beside her, leaned over and whispered, "Not bad for your first lead." Emily laughed softly. "Best turbulence I ever survived." The evening continued with speeches, donations, and stories from veterans whose families had lived for decades in the long shadows of sacrifice. Then Elijah rose for his closing remarks. He stood carefully, leaning only lightly on his cane now, his voice steady. "Courage isn't always in fire," he said. "Sometimes it's in what we're willing to admit about ourselves after the flames are gone." His gaze settled briefly on Margaret. The line needed no explanation. At the reception afterward, people gathered in smaller circles beneath the golden light, spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the sunset painted the airport skyline in orange and rose. A woman approached Margaret near the refreshment table. It was Jenna Turner, the same tired but kind mother from row 23 on the flight, now smiling with quiet pride. Beside her stood Caleb, still clutching the same stuffed dinosaur, though now dressed neatly in a school blazer. "He wanted to show you something," Jenna said. Caleb, cheeks slightly pink with nervous excitement, held out a folded paper certificate. At 8 years old, his freckles and wide, earnest eyes still carried the same innocent honesty that had first pierced Margaret's defenses on the plane. "It's for my writing contest," he said. Margaret unfolded the paper. First place, kindness above the clouds. Her throat tightened. "I wrote about how kindness won on the airplane," Caleb explained. "My teacher said it helped the whole school talk about treating people fairly." Margaret knelt slightly to meet his eyes. "That may be the most important award in this room." Caleb grinned. A little later, Ruth approached Margaret by the window overlooking the glowing runway. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Ruth lifted the folded gray scarf she had been carrying all evening. "I made this," she said gently, "for Seattle nights. They get colder than people expect." Margaret stared at the scarf, her eyes filling again. The wool was soft, hand-knit, imperfect in the way only real love makes things beautiful. "I don't deserve this," Margaret whispered. Ruth smiled, warm and knowing. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing what grows next." Margaret accepted the scarf with both hands, holding it like something sacred. Behind them, Elijah joined them near the glass wall, his reflection merging with the sunset-lit runway beyond. The three stood together in a silence no longer defined by shame or injury, but by what had been rebuilt from it. Outside, a plane lifted into the golden horizon. Inside, the fading sunlight wrapped them in amber. Margaret looked from Ruth to Elijah, then out at the aircraft disappearing into the evening sky. A month earlier, a flight had exposed the ugliest part of her past. Tonight, another view of the runway gave her something different. A future. They stood there together, Margaret, Ruth, and Elijah, smiling softly in the warm glow of the Seattle sunset reflected across the airport glass. The scarf in Margaret's hands, the memory of the journey behind them, and the life it had changed forever stretching ahead. And that was where the story ended. Not with punishment, but with transformation, forgiveness, legacy, and three people smiling beside the window as the last light of day turned the sky into gold. Sometimes, the most important journeys in life are not the miles we travel, but the truths we are forced to face along the way. This story reminds us that dignity, kindness, and respect should never depend on someone's appearance, age, background, or the seat they occupy in life. In our everyday world, it is easy to judge people in a single glance, at work, in public places, online, or even in our own neighborhoods. But every person we meet is carrying a story we cannot see, battles they have fought, sacrifices they have made, and pain they may still live with. The lesson is simple, but powerful. Treat people with humanity before you know their story, because respect given early can prevent regret later. Prejudice, pride, and silence can wound deeply, while one act of fairness can heal more than we imagine. In daily life, this means listening before judging, choosing compassion over assumptions, and teaching the next generation that character matters more than color, class, or status. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes kindness can change the world. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what lesson this story gave you in your own life. If you believe dignity should always rise above discrimination, type Amen in the comments so this message can reach more hearts. Please like this video, subscribe to Stories That Change Lives, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another life-changing story. May God bless every person watching today. Fill your home with peace, your heart with compassion, and your life with the courage to choose kindness even when it is difficult. Amen.